Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring the stories of two people who ventured into the Great Smoky Mountains and, instead of finding peace and quiet in the forest, came face to face with creatures they still can't explain. I love this kind of story. First, because they genuinely unsettle me. And second, because the possibility that there might be something beyond what science can currently explain is incredibly fascinating to me. I hope you enjoy these stories as much as I did. Let me know what you think in the comments. Even if I'm not always able to respond as much as I'd like, please know that I read every single comment. And more often than you realize, your words are what motivate me to keep going with this channel. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you happened years ago, on a night when I did something I absolutely shouldn't have done. I've replayed it in my head more times than I can count, and even now I can trace it back to a chain of small decisions that, at the time, didn't seem like a big deal. But to really explain how I ended up standing in that yard in the middle of the night, staring into the tree line, I have to go back a little further, because none of it makes sense without the context of what was going on in my life, and why I thought breaking one simple rule wouldn't matter. It started months earlier, back in Denver, inside a house that looked perfectly normal from the street, but felt like it was slowly coming apart behind closed doors. That was the year my parents' divorce stopped being an argument and became something real. Something with paperwork and court dates and long silences at the dinner table. I was old enough to understand what was happening. Old enough to feel the weight of it. And even though I tried to act like I could handle it, the truth is I carried that tension with me everywhere. I cried more than I ever admitted to anyone, mostly at night, because even though I tried to act like I was handling it, it felt like the ground under our family was constantly shifting. My sister, on the other hand, was 7 years younger than me, and while she understood that something was wrong, she didn't really grasp what divorce meant. She just knew Mom and Dad were angry and that the house didn't feel safe anymore. That spring, during Easter break, my parents decided it would be better if we spent a couple of weeks away while court dates and meetings were happening. So they sent us to stay with my mom's sister, who lived out in the Smoky Mountains. We had always loved going there. Our aunt was the kind of adult who treated us like we were capable of more than we thought we were. She took us to little independent bookstores in nearby towns, gave us small projects to help with around the house, and let us feel like we were part of something steady. After months of tension in Denver, the idea of escaping to the mountains felt like relief. Her house was big, much bigger than ours in the city, and the backyard didn't really feel like a yard at all. It just stopped. And then the forest began. Dense trees and rolling ground, that endless stretch of green that looked almost unreal if you were used to sidewalks and traffic. There was another house nearby. Maybe a 2-minute walk if you cut across the gravel path. So it wasn't completely isolated, but to us, it felt like the middle of nowhere. At the same time, the small village area with a general store and a couple of homes wasn't far on foot. It was that strange in-between, close enough to people, but still wrapped in wilderness. Our aunt always had rules, and she never presented them as suggestions. We were not allowed to go into the forest alone, ever, especially not my sister. We could play in the backyard, but we had to stay together. If anything felt strange, we were to come inside immediately and tell her. We were not to talk to strangers, and under no circumstances were we to leave the house at night. When it got dark, it stayed dark. Most years we followed those rules without questioning them. But that particular year, I wasn't in a great place mentally. I was angry at my parents, confused, and at that age where you think breaking a small rule proves you're in control of something. I remember noticing that every single evening, without fail, my aunt closed all the curtains the moment the sun started dropping behind the trees. She checked every lock. She even walked through the house to make sure no window had been left cracked open. It felt excessive to me at the time, especially because nothing ever seemed to happen. But, at the same time, I kind of found it funny. It was that era, especially in more rural areas like that, when women living alone were still looked at with a certain level of suspicion. People whispered. They filled in the blanks with their own stories. So growing up, especially during my teenage years when your imagination runs wild and you think you've got everything figured out, I half convinced myself that my aunt was some kind of witch or had something supernatural going on. Not in a serious way, but enough that I'd joke to myself about it. Like maybe all her strict rules and strange habits were just her own little quirks. Or maybe she'd let those old mountain superstitions mess with her head a bit. I was young, and like most young guys, I thought I knew everything. There was one rule she added that year that I don't remember her emphasizing before. She told us that if we ever heard someone calling from outside the house at night, we were not to open the door or the window. It didn't matter if it sounded like her. It didn't matter if it sounded like each other. We were to come get her immediately. She didn't smile when she said it. She just made sure we nodded. For the first few days, everything was normal. We explored the yard. We helped her reorganize a shed. We drove into town for books and groceries. And for a while, I actually forgot about the divorce and the tension back home. The mountains felt quiet in a good way. Heavy, but peaceful. Then one night, I woke up to someone calling my name. At first, I was disoriented. The room was completely dark because of the thick curtains, and for a second I thought I had been dreaming. But then I heard it again. It was my name, and it was clear. Soft, but urgent. And it was my mother's voice. I remember sitting up slowly, my heart already pounding even though I didn't understand why. My first thought was that something had happened with the divorce, that maybe my parents had driven up unexpectedly in the middle of the night. I went to the window and carefully lifted the blind just enough to see outside. At the edge of the yard, right where the grass gave way to trees, I saw her. She was standing near the tree line, partially in shadow, but it looked exactly like my mom. Same posture, same hair. She raised her hand slightly, like she was signaling for me to come closer. Something I hadn't mentioned before, but that probably matters, is that my mom actually grew up in that house. She played in those woods as a kid, and because of that, the trees where I saw her standing that night were the exact same trees she had grown up around. I didn't think, and I didn't question it. I just felt a rush of relief, like maybe everything back home had been resolved, and she was there to get us. I left my room quietly and walked through the dark house, trying not to wake my sister. Even though I felt this surge of hope and excitement, like maybe everything was about to go back to normal, there was also something in the back of my mind telling me it could just as easily be the opposite. I was scared it might be something bad, like the divorce had taken a turn for the worse, and I didn't want my sister to have to deal with the fallout of whatever had happened between my parents. The floors felt colder than usual. I unlocked the front door and stepped outside, calling for my mom as I moved around the side of the house. The air was sharp, and the forest beyond the yard looked thicker than it had during the day. She was still there, just at the edge of the trees, and she lifted her arm again, signaling for me to come closer. That's when a small part of me started to feel uneasy. I couldn't understand why she wouldn't just walk toward the house, why she was standing exactly where the trees began. I took a few more steps anyway, and then I heard my aunt behind me, screaming in a way I had never heard before, her voice sharp and panicked as she ordered me to get back inside immediately, and told me that was not my mother. I turned back toward the tree line. What had been standing there no longer looked like my mom. The shape was wrong, and the proportions were off. The outline was human enough to trick you at a glance, but the longer I looked, the more it felt like my brain couldn't properly process what I was seeing. That was when I ran. I don't remember deciding to run. My body just did it. I sprinted back toward the house, barely feeling my feet hit the ground. And I didn't look back again until I was inside and the door was shut. I was shaking so hard I could barely breathe. My sister was awake by then, crying because of the yelling. I collapsed onto the floor and my aunt kept repeating that everything was fine, that I was safe, that I needed to breathe. My aunt kept her voice steady once my sister was back in bed, and she told me I didn't have to be afraid inside that house, because the house was protected, and she had made sure of that long before we were old enough to understand what that meant. But she also said that surviving in the mountains wasn't about being brave. It was about being careful, and about accepting that there are things out there we don't fully understand, and don't need to understand in order to stay safe. She explained that as long as we followed the rules, never leaving the house after dark, never answering voices that called from outside, never reacting to something just because it looked familiar, we would be fine. After that night, Easter break passed quietly. Nothing else happened. The woods behind the house went back to being what they had always seemed to be. Tall trees, damp earth, wind moving through branches. My sister never knew the full story. My aunt told her I'd had a nightmare, and for years, that's what she believed. I never corrected her. We kept visiting every now and then, even after my parents finalized their divorce and life settled into a new normal back in Denver. I never told my parents what happened that night. I don't know if it was because I thought they wouldn't believe me, or because I didn't want them blaming my aunt, but the words just never left my mouth. What did stay with me was the memory of that shape at the edge of the trees, the way it had worn my mother's face just convincingly enough to make me open the door without thinking. In the meantime, like I said, years have gone by, and I'm older now. I've gone back to the Smoky Mountains more times than I can count. Sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, and I still have a close relationship with my aunt. She's older too, slower on her feet, but her routines haven't changed. As soon as the sun drops behind the ridge, she closes the curtains. She checks the locks. She doesn't treat it like superstition. She treats it like habit, like brushing your teeth. Over the years, I've asked her more questions. Not in a systematic way, not like I was chasing some legend, but just in small conversations over coffee or while fixing something around the house. She's never used dramatic language either. She doesn't call them demons or spirits. She just says, there are things in the forest that don't belong to us, and that some of them have learned that children are easier to approach than adults. She says, imitation is one of the oldest tricks in nature. Plenty of animals mimic sounds to hunt. I've also come across other accounts, not official reports, not anything you'll find neatly documented on park websites, but personal stories shared quietly. Usually prefaced with the same hesitation I had tonight before telling you this. Stories about voices outside windows. About familiar figures standing just beyond tree lines. About something that only shows itself when it thinks you're alone. Most of those stories end the same way mine did. Someone almost stepping too far, and then not. It makes me think about all the stories that were never told, simply because their endings weren't as fortunate as mine. The mountains themselves aren't evil. I want to make that clear. They're beautiful. They're grounding. Some of my best memories are still tied to that house and those woods during the daytime, when sunlight filters through the leaves and everything feels open and alive. But beauty doesn't cancel out risk. The Smokies are old. Older than the towns, older than the roads, older than the idea that we understand everything that moves through them. What happened that night didn't turn me into someone who sees monsters everywhere. It did, however, teach me that confidence can be a liability. I broke a rule because I thought I was old enough to know better. I thought I could tell the difference between what was real and what wasn't. I was wrong for about 30 seconds, and that was almost enough. So if you ever find yourself somewhere remote and you hear a voice calling your name from outside, especially at night, don't react immediately. Don't assume. If it sounds like someone you love, call them or text them. Verify it in a way that doesn't require you to step into the dark. And if something makes you uneasy, even if you can't explain why, don't override that feeling just to prove you're rational. There's nothing weak about choosing caution. Some risks aren't worth taking. It's always better to feel a little foolish in the morning than to disappear into the trees because you wanted to be brave. What I'm about to tell you happened to me and 4 friends of mine a little over 25 years ago. Back when we were all in our early 20s and thought we knew these mountains better than they knew us. And before I start, I should probably say that I've never been the kind of person who jumps straight to the supernatural or starts seeing monsters in every shadow, because I've always leaned more toward what can be studied, documented, explained, and at the same time, I never wasted energy trying to prove that strange things absolutely don't exist either. I just never gave it much thought until that trip. But ever since then, I've caught myself wondering what else is out there in these mountains that's older than us and doesn't care whether we understand it or not. Like I said, there were 5 of us, all born and raised in the same small town not far from the Great Smoky Mountains. When you grow up in a place like that, with only a handful of kids, you don't just become friends. You become something closer to family, because you've known each other since you were running around barefoot in the same yards. So by the time we were in our 20s, we'd already done dozens of hikes together, and spent more nights in tents than I can count. That early March, when winter was loosening its grip, but the air still had that damp cold that settles into your bones, we decided to finally do a loop we had been talking about for over a year. Starting and ending at the same trailhead, making a wide circle through familiar ground. With one exception, a waterfall that sat a little off the marked trails and had a reputation for being worth the extra effort if you knew how to navigate properly. The first day went exactly the way you want those trips to go. The forest coming back to life with that deep, wet green that only shows up after steady rain. The ground soft but manageable. The 5 of us joking, catching up, feeling that old rhythm fall back into place like no time had passed at all. By the time we made camp that first night, I was exhausted in a good way. The kind of tired that knocks you out fast. And I slept straight through, which is unusual for me because I normally wake up once or twice during the night. The next morning, though, Liliana mentioned she had heard someone step out of a tent in the middle of the night. Not clearly walking around, but moving just outside the fabric. And when she said that, everyone denied getting up. Jacob then admitted he had woken up drenched in sweat from a dream that felt too real. Something pale leaning into his tent, close enough that he thought he could feel its breath. And when he jolted awake, he found part of his zipper slightly open. We laughed it off at first, because that's what you do when you don't want to give weight to something weird. But I remember noticing that Jacob kept glancing over his shoulder throughout the day, Not dramatically, just enough that it didn't feel like a joke to him. By the second evening, we had veered off the main trail. Not far enough to be reckless, but far enough that you stop expecting to see other hikers. And we set up camp on a patch of relatively flat ground surrounded by trees. The air was damp and cold, and after dinner we turned in early because the next day was supposed to be the push toward the waterfall. Sometime deep into the night, I woke up to a sound that didn't match anything I was used to hearing in the woods. Not footsteps exactly, and not an animal moving through brush, but a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled slowly across wet leaves. If it had been footsteps, I probably would have just turned over and gone back to sleep, figuring that in a group of 5, it's normal for at least one person to get up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. But no, the sound was definitely dragging. I lay there at first convincing myself it was nothing, because your brain always tries to file things into categories it understands. But the sound kept circling the campsite, and that's when I carefully shifted and looked through the small vent opening near the top of my tent. At first, I couldn't focus, because I had just woken up, and everything outside was that gray, half-lit darkness. But then I saw one of them, standing maybe 20 yards away with its back to me, and it looked almost human in shape, except the proportions were wrong. The spine curved too sharply, the shoulders narrow and sloped, the skin pale in a way that didn't reflect light properly, and it was dragging its feet instead of lifting them. As my eyes adjusted further, I noticed a second figure, partially hidden behind a tree, positioned like it was watching the first one, and I could see its face enough to know the eyes were large and dark, but not in a way I could define. Not animal, not fully human either. Just wide and fixed. There was no sound coming from them other than that soft scrape against the ground. Before I could even decide whether I was still half dreaming, Jacob's tent zipper tore open in one quick motion, and the sound of it cutting through the quiet made both figures react instantly. They didn't sprint like animals, and they didn't run upright like people. They moved in this low, uneven way, fast but controlled, disappearing between the trees in seconds. Jacob later said he had seen them clearly enough to know he hadn't imagined his dream the night before. Obviously, everyone at the campsite woke up and started peeking out of their tents. Jacob kept repeating that it hadn't been a dream, while I tried to explain what I had just seen. But we didn't need much proof that something had actually been there, because the ground was covered in marks from whatever had passed through. The rain from earlier had left the ground damp, and while there weren't clean footprints, there were long streaks in the mud all around our camp, overlapping drag marks circling the tents in a pattern that suggested they had been there for a while, not just passing through. We didn't talk loudly after that. We gathered into one tent and waited for daylight, trying to rationalize what we had seen without fully committing to any explanation. No one suggested ghosts or monsters, but no one could match what we saw to any known animal either. And the part that bothered us most was the zipper from Jacob's tent the night before, because dragging feet is one thing, but manipulating a zipper requires hands and intent. We broke camp as soon as there was enough light to see clearly and headed back toward the trailhead, skipping the waterfall entirely. When we got home, we asked around, talked to park rangers, even reached out to a couple of local biologists. And while no one officially acknowledged anything like what we described, we did hear quiet stories from older locals about pale figures seen at the edges of campsites, about things that circle but rarely approach directly. Nothing documented, nothing confirmed, just enough similar details to let us know we weren't the only ones. Since then, we've hiked together many times, and we've added perimeter alarms and motion-triggered lights to our gear. Not because we think we're being hunted, but because once you've seen something you can't explain, you stop assuming the woods are empty just because they look that way. It's been more than 25 years, and nothing like that has happened again. Every now and then, when I'm out there and the forest goes too quiet, or I hear something drag across wet leaves, I'm right back in that tent, staring through that vent, at a shape that almost looked human, but not quite.